Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of this fabulous future stack. Thank you for coming. My name is Jeff Kahns, and I'm presenting a roadmap to maturity, crossing those enterprise boundaries and hopefully allowing you to mature your environment across the board. So about me, I'm the principal architect for enterprise monitoring and observability team for Amerisource Bergen. People are Amerisource Bergen, what's that? We're actually a pharmaceutical manufacturer. We're in the top Fortune 10. We're one of the largest manufacturers and distributor of pharmaceuticals in the world. So we have a worldwide footprint, and we have a big enterprise just with cloud and on-prem and all the mix of everything you can possibly see. So we have pretty much everything within it. We've got WAN links. We have interesting stuff like we have to manage scanners in the distribution centers. So it's not something that you would normally think that is part of the monitoring, but it's part of what we do. I've actually been in the enterprise monitoring space for 35 years now. I started a very long time ago in the 90s, working with a company called Pro Tools, which was one of the first OS2 based monitoring tools in there. And I've gone on from then. So there's lots that I've forgotten, lots that everything else and putting into play. But there were lessons learned. I've also been on the vendor side. I've worked as a pre-sales and post-sales engineering. I've done consulting for about 250 of the 500 Fortune 500 companies in various ways doing enterprise monitoring and in the space. So I've learned a lot and looked at and part of that. So what you're going to hear today is some lessons from that journey, that lesson that applies to what I do today, and what can help you guys mature your environment out of place. I've got a maturity model that we'll go over really quick. And one of the questions I want you to think in the back of your mind as you look at the maturity model is, where are you now? You'll see the silos, and just think in the back of your mind. I'll tell you where we are when we go through it at the end of the presentation, just so from that standpoint. And then we'll talk about how to mature your enterprise observability model and platform, and how do you put it into play, and how it impacts your systems. So, and then we'll go over. So first off, we'll start with the model. Any questions at this point? If you have questions, feel free to interrupt. I'll try to answer them. If not, hit me up after the talk, and we'll go from there. So, this is a big, ugly slide, but it's the model itself. And I put everything on it, and we're going to talk through it each step. I had pre-motions, but like, no, let's just look at the model because it gives you that a view of the journey that you're on. So, level 0 is limited monitoring. We all started there at one point in time. Silos everywhere. Minimal notifications, or the notifications come from customers, or you're getting paged in the middle of the night because the entire environment went down and you know your spouse. Users are oftentimes your first line of reporting issues. Things like that. And then minimal IT operations. So the operations are small, they're not integrated in any way. So that's where everybody kind of starts. Then people realize, like, we need to monitor more, we need to manage more, we need to put it into play. So then we go to component level monitoring. So first off, instrumentation is done at a component level, so you monitor the routers, you monitor the switches, you monitor the servers. But it's focused on that and using a lot of the metrics coming out of the tools that the vendors provide. So logging, things like that. The logging that a lot of vendors supply is noisy. They just send everything on the wire. There's no way to filter it. There's no way to turn it down. But as it's out there, it generates a lot of noise. You get excessive event noise because of that, because there aren't a lot of filtering in place, things along those lines from that. You still have that reactive mode to the responses. I get an incident, we get an outage and things like that, and we jump to go and respond and react to what's going on in the environment instead of how's the environment working and can we proactively stop this from happening. This is the dream we all have. Along those lines, as I go up, we'll talk about it a bit more. Then manual root cause determination. It's often painful, it's often months, sometimes years to figure out what's going on, things along those lines. Level 2 then is the advanced reactive. So you start utilizing data from different sources. This is where you start tying your business data into the environment. This is where you tie CMDBs, other assets within the organization, you start looking at Windows and network data together, or server data and network data together, or application data with the infrastructure data together. It's that beginning of that look that they're all the tightness that they're tied together. You start to focus on service impact. So instead of looking at it, oh, this silo is down, this network's down, Windows down, Linux down, databases are down, it's this service. So this is the service offering we're getting out. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but those service offerings, looking at it from that perspective, and it starts changing the perspective of how you look at the data, how you look at the model, and how you look at your entire organization. And then you have rudimentary event correlation. This is where you start that noise reduction. This is where you start putting it into play. This is where correlation comes into the environment. So as you're looking at the enterprise and as the stuff flows through, you are actually starting to correlate stuff together, seeing the patterns, and reacting on them from that standpoint. The next level is level 3 is the next generation monitoring. This is a unified overview. So one of the things, how many here have heard I want to see end-to-end our enterprise from end-to-end across the board? They want that picture, or they want to see everything. That's a pretty big ask, and it's a very mature ask of a monitoring system and a monitoring and organization and an enterprise, because there's lots that go into it. It's not just the monitoring tools, and I'll definitely talk about that in a little bit. You have a centralized data normalization. Taking the data, normalizing it, putting standards, putting it in a common format, cleaning it up so you know that you're comparing apples to apples when you're putting stuff together. You're taking those disparate sources of data and making them the same within context of your organization. Again, when the vendors, chips, and events are flowing through your environment, they're generic because they're just coming from your devices. It's not how your entire system is put together. So as you start bringing that, you normalize that data, you're starting to look at it as a cohesive whole. You correlate events across the entire organization. So the entire enterprise has events going on and things like that. So before you were correlating within silos and things along those lines, now you're starting to add the business. You're starting to add other stuff that's not normally correlated in. An outage in a switch going down, you suppress all the impacted services. But you still have to notify all those people that they're impacted, and then you have to notify the app teams or the customers who are using those servers and things like that. So you start to do that incident level at that point and correlating those events and cleaning them up from that standpoint. At this point, there's still no proactive predictive prediction of failures. You're starting to think about it, you're looking at it in the context of that and putting that into play. And then auto remediation of events, turning the monitoring tool into a tool that can take that churn out, make it so you can do and pull the events and react to them automatically. So you aren't out there having large teams, we have what we call ITCC as our command center, flowing all this data and having all those people putting it into play. If it's something that's repeatable, you can build a roadbook, you turn it into auto remediation. If that auto remediation fails, then you notify those folks and get a human being involved. Then finally, scaled ops, and this is something that New Relic talks about, and it's that high-level automated operations. So automatically turning up and turning down cloud resources, spinning stuff up, reacting to things going on within your environment, doing predictive event management and event with continuous machine learning. So using the machine learning, looking at the patterns, using the tools to actually look what's going on from there. Now, there's lots and lots of vendors out there that promise you that, oh, we're giving AI ops. So you're just plugging our tool and it all goes away. I'm here to tell you, if anybody tells you that, they're wrong. So, and why I say that is because it's not just tools, and we'll talk about a little bit about that as well. Automated resource scaling, so as you get it flow, so if you're doing a push out, one example is if you're doing a Super Bowl ad and you know that you do the Super Bowl ad, you have to scale for the response to that. And then several companies have had that happen where they've taken out their systems because they weren't ready for that. But that's kind of what scaled ops does, allows you to do that. The predictive discovery of events or potential events within the environment. It predicts that something's going down before it goes down, so you can go and remediate it before it you take an incident. And that's a key part of this. Having the right data, having a good machine algorithm and a data model to put that together is very, very important. This leads to faster resolution times because you have less of them and you have better data integrated together, and it just speeds up finding where the problem is, finding that root cause and putting it into play. It definitely moves you from that reactive to that proactive monitoring. So we're looking at the data, we're looking at what's on the screen, and we are putting that into play. Instead of reacting, we're actually fixing the problems and spending the time there rather than taking outages and taking the hit from the customers. And then in-depth analytics. One of the good things about this is as you have all that data combined together, have it normalized, have all the silos in one spot, you can then apply detailed data modeling on that data, and it'll start surfacing issues within your environment you never knew you had. And so scaled ops is all of this combined and seamlessly put into play. Of all the companies I've worked for and all the companies I've talked about and everything else, the only one that has come close to scaled ops is Google and Apple. And Google owns their own infrastructure. It's all homogenized. They have complete control over their environment. How many of us here have complete control over our environment and don't have a bunch of stuff out there? I'm glad nobody from Google's here and Apple, because that's one of those things that is just not there for us because we have these legacy systems and things along those lines. So as you mature, you're dealing with all of those. You're dealing with the legacy. You're moving to new technology. You're building this out from there. Now, those are the levels, and those are put into place, but how do you get there? How do you go up that stack? And that's what the bottom gray bars are for. So the first one is instrumentation. The second one is operational process and standards. So in order to go from limited up, and you notice that instrumentation goes across all of them. You are constantly instrumenting. You are always changing your instrumentation. New stuff comes into play, new technologies, your environment changes, new sources come into play. That all goes there. Operational processes and standards. We'll talk about that in a minute, but operations, process, and standards are key to start that transition because it's taking the tools and integrating them into your business. And it's extremely important. Then we talk about automation. In order to do automated remediation, you need to have automation systems in play. And a lot of times, the monitoring team is not responsible for the automation and not responsible for the automation tools and things like that. So you have to work with them to develop good operational processes, how you tie into it, and build that overall management workflow. And then machine learning. Machine learning is a fabulous tools. It's a fabulous way of doing it, but machine learning is only good as the data you're bringing into it. And that's why instrumentation is about getting those metrics, getting the right metrics, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So I'm going to go through each one of those because that's how you mature it, but we'll talk about that in a second. Any questions on the model? All right. So how do you mature? Maturation is not just tools. And this is one of the lessons I often talk about is I can gone out and instrumented a set of tools in 6 months. Then I'm there for another 2.5 years integrating them into the workspace because that's where the work is. It's not just the tools, it's the process, it's the workflows, it's getting teams to adopt, and things along those lines. I will talk about ways we can make that process easier in this. You collect data that you're in there with focus on the context. Context of the data is how you mature it because as it's tied, you get into context, you understand your entire environment in that context. And the more you look at that and the more you think about that when you're doing the instrumentation and collecting the data and then filtering it, it allows you to set it up to support your businesses and your processes and things along those lines. Processes and standards are the framework. They are the key to making how this all works together. It's the tools are the palette you use, but the framework is all the processes and standards, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then you have to change your perspective, and this is the keyest thing here, the mindset. When we're doing monitoring and stuff like that, as you move up, you notice it was looking at it from a different angle. You're looking at it from just everything into a component to starting to look at services, and then you're looking at the enterprise as a whole. That holistic thinking is how you should be doing it from the start. Because as you mature, as you model, these systems are all tied together. They all work together, and they all depend upon each other. So there are no the silos that we have are put up there for easier to manage and stuff like that. But from a monitoring standpoint, a server is a server is a server. Even if it's in the cloud and stuff like that, you're still getting the same metrics, the same kind of thing. But when you're thinking about it, you have to think about that holistic view. Everything is connected, and business drivers have to be considered, because it's not just IT and things along those lines. That's the other part of a lot of the monitoring tools is they aren't thinking about the business drivers. They aren't tying it into business processes and things like that. Yet, how many of you've been asked by the C-level executives to make charts for them and put that into play to that? I think everyone in here. There's a reason for that, because they need that information. They want that information from there. So we're going to start talking about instrumentation, just a reminder of the model. You'll see that a lot. So let's talk about the biggest myth in the room. Single pane of glass. How many people have heard the concept of single pane of glass? How many people have been asked to build a single pane of glass for the entire organization? Yeah. How many have been successful? There's a reason for that. Yeah. There's a reason a single pane of glass cannot exist in the world, is because we have different audiences who need different views of the same data. And that's the key there. It's of the same data, but you have to put it into context. You have to put it into the context of your audience, and I'll talk about that in a minute. You have to transform that data to meet those different audiences' needs. So when you apply those filters and you're pulling them into play, part of that context and thinking holistically is, okay, I need to build this kind of report for the executives, I have to build this kind of report for the customers, I have to build this kind of support reports for the engineers. So it's having that context and that audience and things along those lines. It's not just infrastructure. How many of us are put into play? Amerisource Bergen is a fine example of this. We deployed New Relic, and New Relic being the fabulous APM tool it is, how did we start deploying it? We deployed it as an infrastructure monitoring tool first. And so our journey is going from infrastructure monitoring into APM rather than the other way around. But that was because the mindset was, oh, I want my infrastructure monitored first and go from there. You have to think about it cohesively, and that's where a big part of that is. How is everything related? This is a question that is very important when it comes to maturing. You have to think about what are the topologies, and not just the topologies of the standard network maps and things like that. You have to think about the topology of the services. You have to think about the topologies of the business offerings. You have to think about how all those topologies fit together. Microtransactions, clouds, all of those have those disparate areas that they're in, but you have to think of them together. The process flow. I have an application. What's the process flow through the application? What are the touch points that, if it goes down, will impact my users, will generate an incident? You have to understand those. A big one is the upstream, downstream dependencies. Understanding who relies on me and who do I rely on, and being able to pull those together. And then impact on the users. That's the bottom line for all of that we do, is that bottom line impact on users. So we're going to talk a little bit about audiences and metrics. And I actually wrote this slide about 25 years ago. And I've changed it every once in a while just to update the different types of metrics that are out there. But lines of business, service offerings, applications, servers, network. Those are silos in a lot of places, but you can't have an environment today without having servers on a network. So the network has to be there. The servers can run, but if they don't have applications running on them, what's the point of having servers? Service offerings have to have all three of them in play in order for them to be put out. And then the lines of businesses, of course, are built on that. They're all attached. And if any one of them is failing within that context, you need to know about it. So you look at the types of metrics. You got latency, traffic, errors, saturation for networks, CPU, disk, memory errors for servers, latency, traffic, and throughput, availability on applications. Then you start getting into the ones that normally aren't part of the enterprise monitoring space, you think. It's availability, mean time to detect, mean time to repair, performance, satisfaction, capturing those metrics within the service offerings and that. And then, of course, for the C-level executives, it's what does it cost? Are we performing within our SLAs and SLOs? How many outages and how much do those outages cost us? And Are we available? Are we working? Are the lights on? From that standpoint. So then we look at the audiences. So we have the network engineers. Operations often look at the network. Server engineers and operations look at the servers. The application owners, the application developers, and operations look at applications. They're tied together, and that's how most of our organizations are set up to look at it from that level. But as they're tied together, you have to pull that up in that. So the operations continually climbs up through that, and so does the monitoring. But then you look at the business owners and the application owners with the offerings. So they start being aware, and that's where you suddenly get a change of the data and how the data has to look. And then you get into the C-level executives and the business owners to get the costing and stuff along those lines. So that is why a single pane of glass is not possible, because you have to cover all of those audiences for all of those metrics, for all of those spaces in context. So first off, we'll talk about quality of metrics. Coverage. The more of the enterprise that is monitored, the greater the accuracy of the data in context. One of the big problems I think we all have in our maturing of the environment is actually buying tools. Why the tool creep that we all get is, oh, we have to buy a tool for this and buy a tool for that and buy a tool for that, because they won't allow us to fully deploy the expensive tool and things like that. So that's a big thing that hits the environment. Process flow. Understanding how the data flows through the organization is critical. Knowing where it flows, and not just data on the wire. It's how does the service get to the customer? How do they flow? Who gets it? What are the end users? Things along those lines. So it's a much broader view than normal. And then understanding what metrics matter. So we all hear about KPIs. Define your KPIs. And it's like, okay, you can do that. What metrics do I need to build that KPI? You have to think about that as part of the maturing, because that's where it comes into play. You can build all sorts of KPIs, but do I have the metrics to support it? Can I instrument it? Am I missing something? From that standpoint. Data normalization is a near and dear subject to my heart. Making the data from the disparate sources fit a standard format. I've written so much code in my life just to translate the logs, the timestamps and that into something that's common across my stuff, just so I can look at it, so when I see it, put it into play. When you do that, it allows you faster processing of the data, better processing of the data. You're looking at the same things. You don't have to write 500 different ways of looking at that data from there, because it's all once. You translate it once, and then you apply the same standards across the board. It makes defining the context easier. And again, you've seen a theme here. Context matters in everything we do. And that's where a lot of the maturity comes from, is by building context, understanding your data, your environments, in how they're put together in full context from a business perspective, an operations perspective, and an engineering perspective. That's how you climb that maturity ladder. So let's talk a little bit about extract, transform, and load. Everybody has heard about ETL. It's like, okay, ETL is not a standard topic for a monitoring tool, but extract, you go out and get the data from the sources where the data lives. You don't copy all the sources. You don't, everything else. Go get the data where it is. Multiple data sources are often used because you want to go grab where it is and validate against them sometimes. Then you do the transformation of the data once you get it. First off, clean it. Resolving inconsistent and missing data, very important. How many here have CMDBs, and how many of them here have CMDBs that are actually up to date? Easy questions. I mean, we're throwing the snowballs out there. But that's part of this, is that normalization of not knowing what you have and what you don't have, that missing data. It impacts us greatly. Then you do the normalization. This is where you take formatting rules that are applied to the data collected. This is how you transform them into that normalized data and put it into place. So that's a key function of that. Deduplication. This is where, okay, I'm getting this from different sources. Which one's the source of truth? I'll deduplicate it and only use one from there. Then you sort it. And sorting is so much fun because the data can be organized by type, organized by organization. It could be ordered service level, the service you're offering, the business lines. You can use that. Sorting puts it in context. And that's a way of adding context to the data, is how you sort the data within your organization. And I know that's kind of odd. And then data validation. Is the data that I'm coming and getting from my sources valid? Is it right? Am I getting errors? So you have to constantly be vigilant watching that from there. And then load. You load into the target database, in this case our lovely NRDB, Or you have multiple destinations, data lakes. Everybody has data lakes. They want to do analytics, things along those lines. So having a way of doing that. I had a conversation with New Relic about 4 months ago about this very conversation, because I said, one of the weaknesses I see in New Relic is I have no way to do ETL. I want to do data normalization at the beginning of the pipeline. Well, guess what? New Relic has created a new ETL pipeline for us. So based on this, it's a new feature. It's right now it's in beta testing one of their customers, and we will be getting it soon. It's data normalization at ingestion. So we'll be able to take that at the wire and do that normalization and apply tagging programmatically as the data flows into the environment. So a couple of the details about it, and I'll have a couple diagrams on this, is you can add new data in seconds. So you can pop up that rule, put it into play, and it automatically starts normalization as soon as it's turned on. Multiple formats of the data are at the start are JSON, SQL, CVS, so you can pull that data in from that standpoint. And you can output it in that standpoint as well. Other inputs are Kafka, so you're using your Kafka queues, REST, an API, all your S3 data from there, and then you can actually do both push and pull of the data using the ETL pipeline in front. So this is the workflow. You got your metrics, your logs, and everything else on the side. You have an ETL cluster, which is a set of drawing a blank, containers that are running, their whole sole job is to do clustering. So as that cluster goes put into play, you cluster them to give you your workload, because doing that data translation and stuff on the fly has some cost to it. But we can do it with containers. The other thing that they're adding to it is allowing you to have state. So you can look at your data and have the state of the data and track that with the new ETL pipeline. And that's something that is really cool, in my opinion. So once that's caught, the rules and configs, I'll talk about how they get there, but there's those rules and configs that are set up. They're easy to do. And then the data comes out of it. It goes into the New Relic cloud, goes into their standard ingestion pipeline, into NRDB, and then NR1, and you use your data across the board. Tagging, which we all have problems with tagging, wanting to have those tags at the source, can be done when you bring it in. So as it comes through, you'll be able to do that. So as we look at the top, so the activities up top is how they're doing it, the infrastructure that is required below. So first off, you establish the pipe. You can either do on-prem or AWS. If you're going to use AWS Private Link, you need to have Kubernetes. So you can choose to build your own on-prem ETL cluster or put it out in the world. Then Xforms is the mechanism that they're using to do those rules and everything else. So you build Xforms, lightweight language, JSON-like, and that's where you build it out to put these rules in play, how you programmatically change that. There's two at the start built in right away is multiple counting routing. So you can route data to multiple accounts. So instead of just having, you can actually, if there's two accounts that need the same data, you can now route it to multiple accounts within the system. And then the on-the-wire tagging, and that to me is the critical one. But then you can also do custom level deployments using Flink. Apache Flink is a state-based streaming processor that allows you to do deeper programmatic changes to the data across the board. It's part of New Relic's support for open source and things like that. So they're using that, but it gives you a streaming pipeline that you can fully programmatically and get very complex and as you need to do to put that into play. So yes, there's a complexity to it, but the base stuff is there and you can expand it as you want. And then ingesters. You got the push-based ingesters, you got the logs, and then you got Kafka. And that's the three that are going to be released out of the gate with there. Most of those we use already and put that into play. Yep.
This is all really exciting. The first use case that came to my mind is in terms of transformation. Very simple where you're just, if in your policy you're only getting sort of like these like pseudonymized IDs, like sales tools IDs, things like that.
Yep.
A simple lookup. Is there like a light, what's the lightest weight implementation of this? All I need to do is just like map the data against some like simple lookup.
The lookup table is the X form. It'll say, if you see this, pull it out. It's that easy. So that's the simple is they made it so that you can contextualize any of the inflow and put your own parameters on it if you want. It's literally that simple. Oh, I want this one field out of this Java error log, lovely verbose things that they are, it'll pull that out from there. I don't have the answer to that, but I will get it for you. I'll have your New Relic, reach out to your Relic, and we'll get somebody to answer that for you. I just don't know from that standpoint. I'm not sure what the lightest is, because this is new technology, and they're still tuning it and things along those lines. Yeah, from that angle. So then when you get it in, you test and tune. This is part of those life cycles I've started talking about. You get data in New Relic. Does it make sense? Are they correct? Am I targeting right? Am I filtering them right? Put that into play. You can do configurations. One of the things is downsamples. So instead of taking all those logs and everything else, you can actually control the amount of data flowing into your system using this as well. So you can say, I only want 10% of this or 20%, and you can clean that out. So that's programmatically in there. And it secures the PII, PHI, all of those. That's a native part of that in place. So that is just all of those filtering capabilities are in there. Then you view it in a Relic. It goes in NRDB. It's standard NRDB data. It's tagged. It's as everything as you're used to doing. You view it in a Relic on dashboards, and NR1 is normal. And then to operate and manage, you have a centralized control. So all of those rules and everything else you build in New Relic user interface, and then ship it out to the cluster to run them. So as you change all the centralized command and control from one place. So if a rule is not working, you can just click a button and turn it off. So you aren't messing up your data and things like that. You do have complete control over it in a central spot. It's also tied into standard Kubernetes deployments and pushing that out from there. So really cool new feature, and I was very proud to announce that. And it was, it's cool how they innovate like this. And this will make all of our lives easier, especially on the maturity journey. So here's our lovely maturity model once again. So let's talk about operational processes and standards. The biggest one we all need, and we don't do very well, is the onboarding process. How do you onboard people into the tools? How do you onboard the organization into the tools? How many people here have teams come up to you and say, I need to monitor something, tell me what to monitor? Pretty much all of us. And it's like, okay, how do you answer that question? Well, we as monitoring folks don't know the application. We don't know all the ins and outs of that, but we need to understand that to help set up the monitors. But we also need to teach the teams to do that. Part of that maturing that is putting that out into the environment. By using an onboarding process, that's your mechanism to teach them, to put them with the monitoring in mind at the beginning. I can't tell you how many times they release a new product and they say, oh, can you monitor this for us? And it's been in 3.5 years of development. And it's like, no, I literally had that happen. They turned it on, and I actually said, no, I can't, because you didn't instrument anything. They were a little annoyed with me saying no, but I just showed them, okay, tell me how I'm supposed to. It's getting everybody in the organization to think about monitoring and how they're doing that at the development, at the app layer, at the deployment layers, all of that. Standardize the way the data is defined. This is where you get standards. You put your standards in play. We want the data to look like this. Imperative that it's kept up to date. So you want to keep the data up to date. You want to keep it put into play. You use processes and standards to keep your CMDBs up to date. You use that. You have feedback loops. You have life cycles to put that into play. The one reason all of our single sources of truth are not single sources of truth is there's not a life cycle to keep them up to date. And the data moves and things along those lines. So I'm going to show you a life cycle and an onboarding process here in a minute. You develop a CI onboarding process that includes auditing as well. You have to have that auditing. And this is not a monitoring issue. This is a how do we pull assets into the organization issue. Having that issue there and pulling that into play is important to that. So this is where you have to reach out to the organization. And it's a partnership with the rest of the organization to tie all these things together. Another one is automation, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The other thing is usually the data that we see from the observability platform to confirm that the data is right. If we see discrepancies, you do the auditing and things along those lines. So it's a self-feeding environment if you set it up correctly. And then metadata and tagging. We all spend hours looking at our tags, trying to figure out how to put all this stuff together, what makes sense or not, but you use it to provide the context of the data. And this is where it happens, is at that metadata layer and the tagging layers. It should be integrated with the single source of truth once you've cleaned it up. You should have a standard convention. Now, I don't know how many here are mergers and acquisitions and grow by that. I've been in a lot of companies that are. Right now we're going through an acquisition of some companies in Europe, and our data centers are LDC and EDC over there, they're RDC and ADC here. And we use the naming convention of what data center they're in. That doesn't work, and they're shifting loads around and things along those lines. You have to think about, okay, what is my naming convention if XYZ, we acquire it and put it into play? It's that larger thinking that is key to this, and that's these things we often don't think about. And this is where you have to talk with management. This is where you have to talk to the executives. You have to talk to applications across the board to do that. Should be hierarchical, but if you don't want to, that's okay. But hierarchical, oftentimes that's how we think of things, and it makes sense. But it doesn't have to be. But having that structure, if you have that context, that helps put that into play. And also can be used to create topologies outside of direct connections. So we all put the thing in, show me how my stuff's connected, and then put that into play from there. So how do you bring a business objective and watch it on the wire? You can't. How can you, a service offering, what are my costs and things like that? So that's where you can take those, put those in and say, okay, go and grab this out of my financials, and I can put the numbers to it and things along those lines. Again, not monitoring, typical, but as you mature, in order to show those shifts, when you do a advertising campaign and you expect a huge load to your servers, I need to be tied to those advertising ideas and that things like to get that done. And that's where doing that tagging and contexting and those processes and standards are so, so, so important to doing this. Any questions? So, talked about life cycles. This is our lovely life cycle. Looks really extensive. Go ahead. Yep. 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 And that's where the pipeline comes into play. Those tags make sense and everything else, so you tag them, and then they run the reports for, okay, I want to, how much carbon footprint is this costing me? I take the data, I can go and say, these are all that you want to account for because they're tagged, and that's your data set. And then they do the math in the analytics engines and things like that. So you have the context of the data, okay, I've got this data, I know this will fill your report. So you can actually pull the data out to meet the needs of the report. It doesn't necessarily have to sit on the tags, but it can.
Well, I guess it's like, where is that number? So like the tag might be like the carbon impact.
Yep.
And then be like a whole like 5.
Yep.
Is that value stored in a separate structure?
Yeah, usually. I mean, it's like in other data tables, in other areas that's tracking that. Or it could be in data structure you have. Well, no, and that's a good question for New Relic, because, and I can't answer that one here, but that sounds like a feature request to me, Alicia. So what we're doing actually right now is we have a data scientist who's looking at the New Relic data because we want to look at deviation from norm. So we're actually aggregating the data and we're pulling it out into a data lake. And so we're taking that all that tagging and all that information out there, but then we are bringing the other information into a data lake. So it is not necessarily a New Relic, because we have the data, you try to get the data from the sources where it lives. So instead of copying, but doing those ties. Tagging and metadata is how you tie them together. So from that. All right? Any other questions? Good question, by the way. So, lovely event management lifecycle. One of the first things I came to establish when I was at AB was an event management lifecycle enterprise-wide. So, this is the start. It's easy on paper on the screen. There's 3 steps to a lifecycle. You onboard whatever you're doing into the lifecycle. You analyze the output of what changes you put into play. And then you review them to see, what do I need to change? Am I getting the right data? Is the data wrong? Do I need better thresholds? Things along those lines. Now, if you look on here, it'll show you that the people looking at that are the help desks, the business partners, the developers, and operations, and engineering. It's getting the collective mindset together as an organization to look at it and review that data and put that into play. That review monthly cadence is often used. You can have quarterly cadence depending upon your organization, but having a cadence is the important part of that. Doing that analysis and review is how you keep things together. Then it goes back up to the onboarding, and this is the cool thing about this, is you use the exact same onboarding process to do the rest of the onboarding and the changing that you're going to do to anything you find within you're doing. So then you just rinse and repeat. Very simple, very difficult to do, but this is part of a mature organization, is being able to put that into play and build that out. So, what's an onboarding process look like? Oh, gee, look. I have one here. This particular diagram has been 35 years in the making from there. So, first off, there's 4 steps. It's inventory, app workflow, metrics and thresholds, and mitigation strategies. First off is you get your tools list, you get your monitoring tools, what tools am I using to monitor it, get the CIs that I'm monitoring with. That gives you a tools list and a CI list. Then you look at the application workflow. So first off, you look at dependencies, upstream and downstream. And you also look at the infrastructure dependencies if they're app basic. Those lead to infrastructure diagrams. True infrastructure diagrams, because you're looking at all the dependencies. So you know who you're reaching out to and defining that. The second part, and just if not more important, is that process flow. Sitting down and going through the flow of the data and putting that into play. This is where you look at the end user touch points. This is with that upstream and downstream components. This is where you know you're impacting the user and the touch streams and touch points and where that impact is coming in. You really want to monitor those points because those are the ones that are going to kill you. Then you look at metrics and thresholds, and I touched on this a little earlier. The KPIs or KPIs. What are the key performance indicators? What is the criticality of them? So some KPIs are not as important. I had, when I was at my last job, billing at the beginning of the month and the end of the month, this system had to be rock solid. For 20 days in the middle of the month, they didn't care. But when it was up and doing the billing, it had to be, so it's time-based, things like that. It's like, when is it critical and when is it not? Then what metrics do I need to build those KPIs? Get those defined, get those put down on paper. What are those thresholds? So out of that list, so anything in green here are a list and documentation of your environment and your processes. So then you get a list of your defined thresholds. These are where you put the monitoring standards, those thresholds get them set up, and you've had them documented. Anything in gold here is what gets outputted. So then what this leads to is dashboards. You also have dashboarding standards. So having dashboarding standards is keying to it and going from there. But then you do the gap analysis. When you go through that, you're like, oh, I'm not monitoring that, or oh, we haven't instrumented this. So you look at that gap analysis. Is it just an instrumentation issue, or do you need to deploy a new tool or a new solution within the environment? Once you do that, you build that mitigation plan, you work that mitigation plan, and then you feed it into the process. And then finally, the mitigation strategy. Who's responsible? So if a database goes down for my application, am I responsible for it, or is the database team responsible for it? Generally, the answer should be the database team, but you need to be notified about it from that angle. So that's where the ticketing comes in. Okay, who gets ticketed? What's the support group? Things along those lines. And then it goes, that's where you get your ServiceNow configs or your ticketing system configs. We use ServiceNow. Then triage steps. When I see this, how do I fix it? What are the steps to validate and or fix it? If you can go and list that down by step, it's suddenly an auto remediation candidate, because if I can do that mechanically, If I can do it by a script and things like that, all of a sudden I can just do that, figure it out, and then fix it or escalate the ticket. So knowing that flow and how those go are important. But it also gives you your runbooks. So if it can't be in monitoring, you get your runbooks and they kept up to date because you're using the same process to go through them. And then last but not least is, what's the root cause determination? What process do I need to determine root cause? 9 times out of 10, we all have problem management teams that go through that, but if we can know what some of those triggers are, that make it easier to determine that, and then we learn and document them, that's there. And that's where that's part of the looking across the flow. And then it ties into problem management workflows. So the bottom two are when you go through the life cycle and onboard, you go through the bottom two all the time. And then the top two, you go through quarterly. So from that standpoint, or yearly, things like that. So you aren't constantly doing that, but it keeps your documentation up to date. That's part of the maturity. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through here. Let's talk a little bit about automation. The automation ecosystem. Automations are only as robust as the automation ecosystem you're playing with. So again, we don't generally own the automation. The automation teams own the automation tools and stuff like that, but we have to integrate with them. It is a two-way communication between them. The holistic planning done during as much holistic planning you can do will speed up adoption. It will speed up use and availability. This is where maturity of your system becomes easier to quantify, because it's like, okay, we've done this, we've fixed these problems, we've automated, and that's where the numbers start coming out. This is where you can prove it, and that's part of the overall maturity. Self-healing of incidents. This is how you do that. So those auto-remediation candidates suddenly become self-healing incidents. The primary goal of all what we do is the reduction of incidents, and the secondary goal is to reduce the number of times we have to wake a human up and work long hours and things along those lines. And then the processes and workflows. Well-designed processes and understanding workflows are critical, because that's what you're automating, are those processes and workflows and how they fit into place. So all the work you just did with your onboarding process feeds right into automation. And it makes that easier and allows you to do it. And they should be designed with automation in mind. And last but not least, we have machine learning. Machine learning allows for deeper analytics, can be used to create better monitoring and learning rules by looking at the data and seeing patterns. It's only as good as the data. And I started this out with the context, putting the data in the context, making sure you have all the data. That's how this is put together. There's a lot of great analytical data, even in a system that is not completely set up. What data sets you analyze, the data sets you have, and start that growth pattern there. We're doing that right now with the New Relic, looking at what New Relic can give us, and we're not fully deployed yet. But we get some great data sets and have some great data analytics that are helping us. You need to understand the business drivers, as well as the metrics, in order to create those effective machine learning policies, because how do you know how to tune that and make sure that things are meeting your needs? And the wider the scope, and I said this before, the wider scope of collection of data, the better those models will be. And then it leads to scaled operations. That machine learning, having those scales tied to the automation, allows for that automatic system running, and that's the goal. Now, I promised you at the beginning of this, I'd tell you where we were on the maturity model. We have 1 foot in level 1 and 1 foot in level 2. And we're dead center in between the two of those. We have some very, very, very immature environments, and we have some stuff that we're making headway on. But that's where we are, and we're just starting the process and development journey. And we're a Fortune 10 company. So you're not alone. We're all doing this together, and things like that. So thank you for your time. Hope this was informative, and if you have any questions, reach out, and I will be glad to talk to you.